everybody. Well, thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk about some of the work I do over at Baylor College of Medicine on the ethics of deep brain stimulation. I'll tell you what that is in a little bit. I'm going to connect that to a couple of ethical concepts, alienation and quality of life, which we actually just got to hear something about already. And some of the work, particularly what I'm going to say about alienation, is drawn from a paper I recently wrote with a couple of colleagues, so I've listed them there to give them due credit. Okay, so first of all, what is deep brain stimulation? Well, it is electrodes implanted in the brain, as you can see in the handy diagram there. They are connected via electrical wires to a pulse generator implanted in the chest cavity, and the pulse generator transmits a small amount of electrical current to the target brain region. So the metaphor that's often used here is that this is a pacemaker for your brain. Kind of cool, right? Okay, what do they actually use this for? Well, it's been highly successful in Parkinson's disease and essential tremor. Now these are what are called motor disorders, so they affect mobility, they cause tremors or other tremor-like symptoms, to the point where sometimes people can't even walk on their own or carry out just ordinary daily activities. So it's been highly successful as a treatment for those conditions, and now there are efforts underway to translate it, as they say, to psychiatric conditions. So things like Tourette's syndrome, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and depression. Now, it's important to note here that the translation efforts, they're only for treatment-refractory versions of these conditions. So in other words, the application of DBS in this kind of context would be like a last resort, right? Because it involves brain surgery and the associated complications that brings with it. The idea is you would exhaust just about every other feasible option first. So these are going to be the most severe kinds of cases. And that's important to note just because you might otherwise ask, why are we messing with people's brain in this direct way? When there are other treatments available. And of course, for the psychiatric conditions, it's typically experimental, with the hope that it will eventually become a standardized treatment. Okay, so as you might imagine, people have raised a variety of ethical questions or even concerns in the ethics literature on this, or the neuroethics literature, as it's often called, since it's dealing with brain modulation. So one that has jumped out to a lot of people is questions about autonomy. So in modulating somebody's brain activity in this way, are we in some sense infringing on their personal autonomy, their free will? Does this have implications for responsibility, either legally or morally speaking? So that's an issue that people have discussed quite a bit here. A related issue, I think, you could put in terms of humanities. So do these kinds of brain modulations or brain implants somehow change how we think about being human? Or are we changing human nature in some way by doing this? That's another issue that people have brought up. It's worth noting that those first two issues I mentioned, they're very much, you might call them theoretical issues in the literature on this. So they've been raised primarily by academics, commenting on these kinds of technologies through the lens of ethical theory. The next two I'm going to mention, though, are drawn, at least sometimes, from actual patient experience. While it's worth noting, it's a rather small amount of case studies. So I'm in no way saying that these kinds of concerns make DBS problematic or anything like that. The idea with this kind of ethical analysis is to identify any potential issues and then be able to figure out what's going on and find ways to address them. But there have, at least in some fairly small studies that have been done, or some case studies that get commented on quite a bit. Been reports of DBS changing patients' personalities in certain ways, or patients or their family members have at least reported certain kinds of personality changes that have led people to, start paying more attention and try to figure out exactly what the extent and magnitude of this would be, if it actually is the device causing it, of course. So the kinds of things that come up most often are things like greater impulsivity, greater assertiveness in interpersonal relationships. So of course, something to definitely keep an eye on, study more, do more empirical work to figure out exactly what the association of that with DBS may be. The one I want to talk to you about today, though, is the concept of alienation. So it's related to the personality stuff, but meaningfully different in a couple of interesting ways, I think. Okay, so what's alienation? Well, the standard way of thinking about it is that as the opposite of authenticity. So are you all familiar with the concept of authenticity? So sort of like being true to yourself, living out your life the way that you want to live. So alienation, the thought goes, is the opposite of that. So to be alienated, to quote one influential paper on this, in this context means that patients no longer feel like themselves. So the person writing this paper, looks at a couple of case studies in which patients undergoing DBS report not feeling like themselves in certain ways. So the thought here is that you don't feel fully yourself, or you somehow feel dissociated from some aspect of yourself. And I'll again emphasize that this is a small number of case studies, but obviously important to address, as these technologies become more and more popular. So, okay, there's also this equivalent idea, or at least I and my co-authors take it to be equivalent, this idea of self-estrangement. So the idea of somehow being estranged or separated from yourself in some respect. I'm keeping things vague for now. I'm going to get a little more specific on how this all might go in a minute. But in the interest of just having sort of a starting point, the definition that we offer in that paper I mentioned is that alienation is an experienced lack of identification with some aspect of oneself or one's life conditions. And the life conditions piece will come back in a little while. Okay, before I move on to these actually, I do want to make the point, again, that the reason to look at concepts like alienation and personality in this context is first of all to just ensure that any ethics issues arising in treatment and research using these technologies, either isn't having problematic side effects, or if it is, identify it and find ways to address it. But another reason to focus on these kinds of concepts, and particularly the concept of alienation, is that some of the conditions that are being treated with technologies like DBS, other neurotechnologies, may themselves involve alienation. So in alleviating some of these symptoms, deep brain stimulation might actually have the benefit of preventing certain forms of alienation. So if you're doing a risk-benefit analysis, you can see this idea of alienation potentially coming in on both sides, actually. And I'll say more about how I think that goes once I get more specific here. Okay, so once again emphasizing that it's not established that DBS does cause alienation, but possible varieties. So sort of getting clear on what to look for in future empirical work on these topics. With the idea being that the role of humanists, ethicists, can be to do some conceptual clarification in order to help identify these kinds of issues, if they exist, in a more fine-grained way, and then be part of the conversation in figuring out what to do about it. Okay, so these are various ways in which you could be alienated from yourself in this way, that we were talking about more generally a minute ago. So there's the general feeling of self-alienation, just feeling, unlike yourself in some, non-specific way. But I think feelings like that can often be much more targeted, and some of the patient narratives that Kramer talks about bear this out. So one thing that you could be alienated from that's more specific is your state of bodily or mental health. So you could imagine, say, in Parkinson's disease, the loss of mobility or the loss of bodily responsiveness. You could imagine that causing a feeling of alienation in somebody. On that basis, perhaps not being able to fully identify with one's own motor functionality. So that may be one potential way in which deep brain stimulation in the context of alienation could be providing benefit rather than causing harm by inducing alienation. You could say similar things about one's mental health, right? You could feel alienated from your mental state in a way in which you don't fully identify with the kind of mental goings-on that you're experiencing. Maybe one example of this could be severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Not claiming that this is exactly the right way to characterize things there, but the category of alienation might be helpful in understanding some of the diagnostic criteria there. So specifically, compulsions with which one doesn't identify, or intrusive thoughts that, given that they're being experienced as intrusive, one presumably doesn't identify with them fully either. Or at least that might be one way to characterize what's going on with some of those diagnostic criteria. Okay, what else could you be alienated from? I should have quizzed you all on this like others were doing before me. There's more on the next slide, so maybe I will. See if you can think of any others for me. You could also be alienated from your agency or particular actions or behaviors. So the idea of compulsive behaviors, or even maybe behaviors that you do without thinking and later regret. Compulsive or impulsive behaviors are a pretty good candidate for ones from which you would be alienated, again in the sense of not identifying with them, not experiencing them as fully your own. And then finally, for self-alienation anyway, your own emotional or cognitive state. So there's a kind of much discussed case in this literature on the neuroethics of DBS that basically revolves around people either feeling inappropriate emotions for the situation that they're in, or feeling lacking appropriate ones. So one of the most discussed cases is somebody who was at a funeral and wasn't able to feel appropriately sad or able to cry, and attributed it to the DBS device. And there's of course much more to say in the analysis there, but that gives you some idea of what we're talking about when we talk about being alienated from one's own emotional or cognitive responses. Okay, so now I guess I'll quiz you, because that seems to be the order of the day. So these are all ways in which you could be alienated from yourself. But my co-authors and I really wanted to stress in this paper that I keep talking about, that I'm drawing from in the talk here, that self-alienation is not the only kind of alienation one could experience. One could be alienated not just from oneself, but as I said earlier in the definition, one's broader life conditions. So what are some other possible objects of alienation that I might have in mind when I say that? Yeah?
Alienation from other people and your relationships?
That's one of them. I've I've got two more on the slide. Other than that one. Anybody else? I mean, what other things, you know, other than just these aspects of yourself, like, what do people tend to find really important in life, or at least spend lots of their time doing?
Yes. One's projects or work.
Yep, that is another one. So you've gotten two of the three. What about when you want to relax and not be, you know, doing work or career type things? What do you do then? Okay, I'll just tell you. So interests or hobbies. So yeah, these are the other examples that we came up with as, you know, sort of clear-cut, you know, major things from which a person could be alienated. Again, in the sense of not fully identifying with them, even though they are an aspect of one's life. So you can imagine somebody finds their career really fulfilling and then ceases to find it fulfilling all of a sudden and just experiences it as something that isn't for them anymore. Language like this describes you know, these feelings of alienation that we're interested in. And of course, a huge one is alienation from other people, right? So no longer finding relationships fulfilling or engaging that one once did. And of course, the ones I have here relate in interesting ways to the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. So that's another, you know, sort of pre-DBS condition where some of this alienation language may be able to help us understand or characterize the diagnostic criteria, the symptoms. So the question is both, you know, does DBS induce these kinds of things, and does it help mitigate them in conditions that involve them? So there's sort of a fascinating dialectic going on about this. Okay, before I get to that one, you know, intuitively, right, feelings of alienation are a bad thing. You don't want to have them generally. I've sort of just been assuming that they're generally bad, but you might wonder, right, well, why are they bad, right? So, like, why is it an ethical issue if DBS is associated with these, or if it helps to mitigate them, and that's a benefit of it? Like, what's the justification for thinking that alienation is so bad? People have proposed various answers. We related it to quality of life, which we got to hear a little preview of earlier, which helps me out in a big way. So there are a variety of philosophical theories of quality of life, and I'll get to those in a minute. But back in the 80s, when the philosophical discourse on this you know, was still very much evolving, this guy Peter Railton proposed a criterion or a principle that applied to these different theories of quality of life that people were working with. And if in the philosophical literature they call it well-being or welfare, but roughly equivalent notion to quality of life. And so he proposed that well-being or quality of life has to involve non-alienation. That is, for something to be good for a person or to benefit her in the way that quality of life concerns, it must, just to read the quote here, have a connection with what one would find in some degree compelling or attractive, at least if one were rational and aware. And then elsewhere in that paper he talks about a similar kind of thing in terms of engagement, so something can't be good for you or benefit your quality of life unless it is engaging to you in some way. And those verbs, compelling, you know, verbs, they're not verbs, are they? Those descriptors, compelling, attractive, engaging, those all seem like the flip side of alienation. That is, it doesn't seem as though one could be alienated and yet alienated from something and yet find it compelling, attractive, or engaging, at least most of the time. There might be some counterexamples. one of my co-authors thought of one. But most of the time, anyway, alienation is going to preclude positive contributions to quality of life if you accept this principle about what contributions to quality of life take. Okay, so that's just like a criterion or like a constraint on theories of quality of life. It's not a theory all on its own. So what are some of the theories that are floating around? Well, one of them is called hedonism. It's sort of grew out of the utilitarian tradition we've heard a little bit about today. And the hedonist view is that what is good for a person or benefits their quality of life fundamentally is feelings of pleasure or happiness or enjoyment. So positive experience. That's the story of quality of life, is that it's about positive experience and the avoidance of negative experience. Lots of objections have been raised to that over the years, so people tried to develop instead a desire fulfillment theory. So the view here is that what benefits you or your quality of life in a fundamental way is getting what you want, right? Fulfilling your desires or obtaining the objects of your desires, or at least some subset of your desires in order to get around of tricky counterexamples that people have come up with. There are also different sort of twists on this theory where you can do it in terms of your values instead of your desires. Maybe values are more stable, and so express your deep self in a stronger way. So we have hedonism, we have desire fulfillment theory. These are both theories of well-being or quality of life that really appeal in a strong way to the experience of the individual subject, right? So it's really a lot about an individual's own mental states, and those are what sort of ground or explain contributions to their quality of life. The next theory, as you might infer from the name, doesn't typically say that it's about the individual's experience or mental state. So the objective list theory, as it's often called, says, in fact, that the various things that are good for individuals, benefit their quality of life, do so independently of any kind of subjective uptake on the part of the individual. So having lots of friends, or attaining knowledge, or being a good person on different versions of this theory benefit a person even if they don't particularly care about those sorts of things. So proponents of this theory are somewhat likely to reject Railton's criterion. Until recently anyway, but I'll get to that. Finally, there's a view called perfectionism that's another major contender, and the idea there is that to know what's good for human beings, we need to figure out what a human being is. So they develop different accounts of human nature and the capacities that being a human being involves. And then they say that it's the exercise of the characteristically or distinctively human capacities that make for quality of life. And typically they end up with a list much like the objective list theorist, but they have this underlying account of why it is that these things contribute. So knowledge, moral virtue, or being a good person, achievement, things like this, they're exercises and successful ones of our human capacities to reason about the world and act, and things like that. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of these just because I want to leave some time for Q&A. But the big takeaway from the quality of life piece here is to say that different theories of quality of life are going to generate different verdicts about how bad alienation is for somebody, and indeed which forms of alienation are the most relevant. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but the point is just that, as you can imagine, right, since they have different views of what quality of life fundamentally is about, so too are they going to generate different judgments or maybe weight differently different kinds of alienation of the various forms that I talked about. And so in the service of sort of future empirical ethics research on DBS and its association or lack thereof with alienation. Basically, the overarching thread here is that we're going to need to take all of this into account. So we need to not just be talking about feelings of alienation in a general way, but in a targeted way, and make some of these conceptual distinctions. And then we also need to distinguish different theories of quality of life in order to be able to ultimately do empirical ethics research, talk to patients, get their experience, their understanding, ideally pre and post deep brain stimulation treatment. And that's going to require, at least some have argued, more sophisticated empirical measures of some of these concepts that look like pretty humanities-focused concepts, right? So how do you operationalize these kinds of things? Well, to do that, you're going to need to do lots of this conceptual work. And the ultimate hope here is not only that this can yield helpful insights on DBS and alienation, but I think of it actually as a two-way street. So given the lived experience of DBS patients who may have experienced alienation both pre-DBS because of their condition, if it involves forms of alienation as we've defined it here, and they may have experienced it concurrently with DBS, although I should emphasize again that this is pretty rare, but there are these case studies out there that have reported this. So given that the patients are that well positioned to talk in terms of alienation and these concomitant concepts, I think that's going to enrich our philosophical theorizing about quality of life as well. Okay, so I wanted to leave time for questions, so I'll just stop there. Thank you very much. Yes?
Yeah, so you said that one of your co-authors came up with a counterexample to the conception of non-alienation or quality of life. I was just wondering what that was.
Okay, good. So I would claim it's only a potential counterexample, actually. So the idea was you could have a really strong, almost irresistible impulse. So the idea was almost that, you could identify with like a compulsion or just like an irresistible impulse. And maybe that's like what it is to have a compulsion or an irresistible impulse. And the response I came up with to that was, you may identify with the object of that impulse, right? And that may indeed be what it is to have an impulse. But what you may not identify with is the fact that you have that impulse, right? So you could have like a second order, sort of like disavowal of the first order impulse, which is, sort of a standard philosophical move to like seek out of cases like that, appeal to like higher order attitudes. So yeah, it's a good example though, because it brings out some of these, really interesting bits of complexity that you start getting into this kind of research. Anything else? Yeah.
Do you usually see these, I know there's a small sample that have experienced these, but these feelings of alienation often go hand in hand with the examples of personality changes, or are they sort of distinct? Does there seem to be any relationship between them?
Yeah, so the way this originally came up was, I think, due to the personality change stuff and the little case vignettes that people were analyzing. And then people started thinking, well, personality changes could, of course, involve alienation, like not identifying with some aspect of yourself. Then again, sometimes with these personality changes, the patient actually does identify with the change. And they'll say things like, I feel like, more myself than I did before. So I didn't mention this, but it's in the Kramer paper. Yeah, like some patients will experience certain changes but then they will in fact experience their pre-DBS life, or years as alienated or somehow inauthentic. And it's not clear if that's due to, the illness then, and now being relieved of some of the symptoms as a device. There's a lot of sort of messiness to unpack. And of course the question is very much a scientific one in many respects. But the reason I did the talk this way was to try and give you sort of just an idea of how I see the humanities being able to come in and make real contributions to some of this more technical and scientific work in the medical field. So I don't want to keep us from enjoying whatever food was just brought in. So thank you very much.